straight. My heart is in peace. My soul is incredibly ready to change history. It's a good to fight the system. To fight the system. It's a good day. It's a we're never gonna stop. We're gonna make it count. When one of us is tired out, the other one will hold it down. We're gonna spread the love. We're gonna spread it around. We're all over the city now, and way down in the underground. Come on. To fight the system. To fight the system. It's a good day. It's a to fight the system. To fight the system. It's a good day. It's a to fight the system, to fight the system. It's a good day. It's a good to fight the system, to fight the system. It's a
All right, I think we're ready to get started. We still have some people coming in through the waiting room, but I would love to welcome everyone to tonight's program. My name is Calla. I work with Mass Peace Action. And first, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Democratic Socialists of America International Committee, MAPA's Peace and Climate Working Group, the Claudia Jones Club at Howard University, Sunrise Cambridge, the Boston Young Communist League, and the District of Columbia Young Communist League. And also shout out to Yeva from Mass Peace Action, who is handling our live stream tonight. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube Live, so feel free to share those. So tonight we are so excited to be having three incredible speakers, Fatuma, Ishan, and Aaron. We encourage you all to ask your questions in the chat. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we welcome you to ask questions and share your thoughts. Afterwards, we'll be sharing a recording, some resources and ways to get involved. And thank you again so much for being here. We wanted to host this webinar because we believe that anti-imperialism is really important to youth organizing, and unfortunately, a lot of anti-imperialist organizing spaces are dominated by older age groups, and we really want to encourage young people to get involved in these movements and to make space and to build intergenerational movements against imperialism across the world. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to my co-moderator, Kate, who is going to jump into our first question.
Thanks so much, Calla. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate. I'm really excited to be here co-moderating and to learn from all the three speakers at tonight's webinar. So for the first question, we wanted to ask the speakers if you could introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about the work that you do or the organizations that you're a part of, and explain how you define imperialism. So I can first pass it off to Fatuma.
Hi, I'm Fatuma. I'm 17 in the UK. I am currently just a student at the moment, and I have like socials. You can see like my work and whatnot. But I think to start off with defining imperialism, I think there's two ways you can go about it. Either like quite a technical definition, or I think more of an introductory like definition that I think is a lot easier to apply, is sort of the expansion or the exportation of capitalism or exploitation. So that expansive sort of movement, I think, is sort of a key characteristic of imperialism that is a bit more surface level, but it's a definition I like.
Great, thank you so much. Aaron, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Aaron Boo. I am a student at Howard University here in Washington, D.C. I am also a member of a popular political education project based in DC known as the Claudia Jones School for Political Education. And I am also a member of the DC Young Communist League, which is the youth wing of the Communist Party of the United States of America. And yeah, thank you for having me. And I guess how I typically sort of try to describe imperialism to people, I really first like to start off by asking people to reconsider the way that we understand imperialism, because when we hear the word imperialism, there's a very popular definition that typically comes to mind. And I typically push back against that definition because that particular definition never really concerns itself, right, with the economics that underline imperialism. We often give a lot of priority and a lot of focus to these very superficial aspects of imperialism. But for me, I understand imperialism first and foremost as a subject of political economy. And I think it's very important for us to understand imperialism as a necessary function of capitalism versus allowing ourselves to think about imperialism in a very abstract sense.
Thank you, Aaron. And lastly, I'll pass it off to Ishan.
Hey y'all, I'm Ishan, originally from beautiful sunny Las Vegas, Nevada, which I miss dearly, currently here in New England, which is a lot less sunny. I'm a student at Harvard to my great shame, but what I really do is I'm a member of the steering committee for the International Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America. And a big part of what we do is help form and maintain relationships with left-wing parties and formations worldwide, and to help combat imperialism by forming international bonds. And as for what I view imperialism as, I think it's very important to note that it is fundamentally an economic phenomenon that almost clothes itself in flags to help perpetuate itself and spread across the globe. And I think it's almost the domination of other nations in pursuit of the profit motive is the way I would define it.
Thanks so much for introducing yourselves. Next, we have a question from Abhishek, who is actually the international editor at China Global Television Network from India. The network is based in China, and thank you so much for submitting these questions. So how aware is the American youth about imperialism and neocolonialism, and particularly the role successive governments in the US have played in perpetuating these policies? Why is it important for the youth to know about anti-imperialist struggles? So Fatuma, do you want to go first again?
I can't really speak on the American youth, but I think young people in general are obviously, for the most part, in education. So I think there's a general, perhaps surface level understanding of like global inequality and maybe like relationships of exploitation. But I think the main sort of thing that's lacking in a lot of young people, sort of maybe bigger picture understanding of these like phenomenon, is sort of putting a name to it and sort of contextualizing it within a system. I don't think young people are, for the most part, like uneducated or unaware. I think young people tend to be quite aware or motivated to learn about things, but I think for the most part, the structure or the bigger context of like global inequality is sort of what I think is lacking in a lot of like young people's understanding. And I think the second part of the question about why young people should be aware, I think historically, young people have the potentiality for sort of great social change. And I think it's quite easy to mobilize young people and organize young people. So I think it's more the potential that's there is why it's so why it's so necessary to organize young people.
I think that one of the problems we have here in the US is a sense of suppressed historical context among young people. And I think that like Fatuma was saying, a lot of young people have this intrinsic and this internal sense that something is deeply wrong with the way we organize our world. And the way our educational system works, it's very, it puts a lot of effort into ensuring that people never really make that connection between that sense and capitalism. And a lot of that is through getting rid of the sort of inconvenient historical facts that our government has done and other Western governments have done. Like, for example, even among highly educated university circles, when you ask people about the embargo on Cuba, very few people know the details of the embargo, why it was put in place and how it restricts basically every good that can enter Cuba. And I think that that sense of historical context is information that has been suppressed almost in the American educational system. And that's one thing that any aspiring anti-imperialist in the US should be working on to help further educate people about this historical context surrounding imperialism.
No, yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think a big part of the problem, right, with understanding these systems of inequality comes from the fact that there's so much rampant political miseducation. And that's because, right, like the ruling class is working tirelessly to ensure that young people can't name the things that we are constantly seeing happen to us around the world. And a big part of that, right, is also like suppressing history. I have many, many peers who have no idea about the actual historical context behind many, many geopolitical conflicts. I remember one time I was talking to one of my friends about the situation in Iraq during the 2003 invasion. And this person, right, like my friend who's very educated, they're a student at Oxford, they had no idea that the charge of Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction was a fabrication with no credible evidence behind it. Whenever we would have any type of conversation about geopolitical conflicts, I was always a little surprised at the fact that this person who I consider to be incredibly well educated just simply doesn't know these things. And so over the time since having made that realization, I've come more and more to the conclusion, right? Like it's not necessarily a question about intelligence or education. It's first and foremost a question of miseducation. So yeah.
Thank you all for sharing. And Aaron, you just mentioned Iraq, and Ishan, you mentioned Cuba. I was just on Massachusetts Peace Action's 1 week solidarity trip to Cuba, where I learned a lot about the impact of the US blockade, which is like really an imperialist policy and the result of like a long history of US imperialism in Cuba. And so our next question relates a bit to US involvement in Cuba, but I think it relates to the fact that when foreign policy issues come to the attention of people in our generation, often progressive language is used to cover for US imperialist and militarist ambitions. And we've seen this for decades. So it's like human rights interventionism as a guise for the US's destruction of Iraq and Afghanistan. And then especially on social media, young people are convinced to support what is essentially like the CIA's agenda under this guise of progressivism. And it's clever marketing. And so, thinking about Cuba, there were a lot of infographics out there over the summer calling for US intervention in Cuba after July 11th's protests last year. And rather than calling for an end to the US blockade, a lot of progressive young people were calling for US intervention. So I wanted to ask if you could speak to the dangers of this imperialism being disguised as progressivism. And I think just anyone, if you have an answer, you can go ahead in whatever order makes sense.
I do definitely think that one of the most effective tools in the CIA's toolkits and other like arms of the US foreign policy apparatus is sort of that concept of the US being the defender of human rights. But I also think, again, going back to this concept of historical context that we think we're going to keep revisiting a lot tonight. I think like definitely one of the most important things we can say in response to that is by highlighting the long history that the US government has had with supporting leaders and rulers in other countries that have been anti-democratic and against the concept of human rights. And I think like once you begin to see that long history, you begin to lose faith, frankly, in your government. I think that's a process that we need to encourage people to have. And I think that this concept of education is something we're going to have to keep coming back to.
I also think like a big part of it, right? Like even more than the idea of the United States being this like defender of human rights and this beacon of democracy, I think it's really important to understand that that is a relatively recent invention, I feel, for the most part. Like if we think about US foreign policy, we it is helpful to also consider, right, like the Cold War, which is really where the United States started to get involved in these military interventions around the world, wherein it was responsible for supporting some of the most anti-democratic and most reactionary regimes that the world has ever seen. And all of this, right, was done in the name of defending people from the evils of communism. However, you know, it's a new world. The USSR does no longer exist. There really isn't this threat of communism that the United States State Department can really submit its foreign policy around. And so as a result of that, as a result of this new vacuum, there is this need to create like a new threat for the State Department and the United States to rally it behind. And human rights and this idea of like bringing democracy to people has really become that new rallying cry that the US uses as a means of legitimizing its imperialist adventures around the world. So yeah, I also think like a big part of that is really helping to expose that contradiction and help point that out to people, because a lot of young people, I feel, are genuinely like very progressive, which again comes back to your example, right, of these progressive young people thinking they are doing their part by like sharing these infographics or sharing this like misinformation to people. Like it comes from a very genuine place. It's really understanding that, right, I think, that allows us to help push them towards like these more progressive directions. And by, again, exposing that contradiction, showing them that the United States has never brought democracy, it has never defended liberty, it has never done any of the things that it's ever claimed to do. I really think that's how we get more young people to make that connection and stop falling into that trap of political miseducation.
Anyone else want to jump in? Otherwise, we have another question lined up.
I just quickly wanted to bring up, in his Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, Kwame Nkrumah makes a distinction between colonialism and neocolonialism. He describes colonialism as crude imperialism and neocolonialism as rationalized imperialism. And I think the term rationalized can be quite useful here when we're talking about like the sort of guise that America and other nations sort of cloak their imperialism in. I mean, I think he specifically was talking about like the guise of it being rational in the sense that states consent in the system. But I think similarly, the attempt to rationalize it with a sort of like human rights defending mythology is sort of a facet of neocolonialism, because colonialism, that's to say sort of pre-independence, was more crude, more unabashed like in its display. But I think it's a lot more insidious when it wants to present itself as morally good, not only for the imperialists, but, and this is sort of the perverted aspect of it, for the imperialized as well, this will benefit you, we are helping you, we're saving you. And I think that's why young people, when not provided with sort of information that counters that, it is, I suppose, understandable why you think, oh, maybe we are the good guys, this is a good cause, because it's sort of cloaked with this like appropriated, like progressive language. So I think the way to counter that is, like Aaron said, providing the facts or the reality of what American imperialism is capable of and has done.
Yeah, and I think your use of the word rationalization, there is so much rationalization and normalization of global imperialism and inequality. And I think, the global inequality between the global South and the global North is just something that we accept as normal and acceptable, and that is never going to change. And that's something you've written about under development. One of my favorite Michael Parenti quotes is that countries in the global South aren't underdeveloped, they're overexploited. And I was wondering if you could just speak to the idea, Fatuma, of understanding imperialism and how we all benefit from it as people living in the imperial core, and how imperialism is the root of so much of this global inequality.
I think sort of the first step, and what was useful to me in sort of understanding it, is understanding inequality as a relationship. It's not that some countries happen to be poor and some countries happen to be rich. I think it's understanding that these like states feed off of one another. A certain state has taken itself up to development because of its underdeveloping of other nations. And I think once you understand it as a relationship, I think it sort of clarifies, I think, the idea, because a lot of people are aware that like, oh, nations in Africa are very poor and we should be very grateful that we live in, a wealthy country and whatnot, but there's not, the link is not made. And I think it's interesting that you bring up Michael Parenti, especially in regards to people in the imperial core benefiting from imperialism. In his, I've got it written down here. Yeah, in Profit Pathology and Other Indecencies, which is one of his books, he sort of talks kind of briefly about the way in which people in the imperial core are sort of manipulated into like consenting to and paying for imperialism through the guys that they do benefit from it, which I suppose in the bigger picture they do. But I think it's also more important to differentiate between the sort of imperialists who are the CEOs of Raytheon, the political elites and whatnot, and people in the imperial core who might benefit from imperialism but also are disadvantaged by it. I think it's more important to talk about, for example, in America, the Black community are descendants of colonial subjects. They themselves are colonial subjects. And so I think the idea that I don't want to generalize about people in the imperial core as being, beneficiaries of imperialism, but I think the main idea is understanding imperialism as a relationship, and then secondary to that, contextualizing oneself in that relationship is an important step to sort of demystifying the whole thing.
Thank you, Fatuma. I think I'll ask if Aaron or Ishan have anything to add to that question, but if not, I have another question ready to ask.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention really quickly, I think one of the core reasons why imperialism exists, like what its justification is to fundamentally maintain the extraction of resources and wealth from the global South to the global North. And I think that's like an incredibly important lens to view things in. World politics makes so much more sense when you begin to view things through the concept of resource extraction and wealth extraction. I think that's something vital that we should be communicating.
Yeah, and I was also going to add, like, I feel like, well, there is this tendency, right, to think about capitalism as this like closed system. Like when we think about capitalism and when we're taught about it, we don't ever really stop to think about the ways in which capitalism develops equally, well, not equally, but unequally around the world. We don't really stop to consider, right, how all of these like uneven levels of development are somehow connected to capitalism as this much larger system, as this totality. And so again, I also think it's like very, very important for us to illustrate to people, right, that there is not really this like separate capitalist bubble. Like we are all a part of this like global system of capitalism and imperialism. And it's really, again, only by making that connection that we're going to be able to help people like realize the importance of rallying behind like principled anti-imperialist lines, because people aren't really going to get involved in any type of political struggle unless we can show them, right, like how they can materially benefit from that struggle. And so again, it's by showing people, right, that the struggle against like capitalism and imperialism are like one and the same, and that in the end it all benefits us.
Thank you both for sharing. I agree. I think rethinking imperialism and capitalism in a way where we understand how we're impacted and also benefit, and just like seeing ourselves as like involved in these systems and not as these things that are separate from us, can really change how we think about like how we can bring about change. You've also talked a lot about how like the impact of misinformation, and this next question is directed towards Ishan and is really intended to like highlight truth about the US's role in history and current events and what's actually happening. So the question is like, is the US an empire, and how is the US currently engaged in imperialism around the world? But we've touched a bit on that. So I thought it'd also be interesting to ask, what other countries would you identify as imperialist countries? And do you think that the US is right to accuse Russia and China of being imperialist?
So to answer the first part of that question, to start off with, is the US an empire? And I think the answer, as we all agree, is like an emphatic yes. And I think US empire functions on many different levels. There are the parts that are more visible that everyone knows about, like the US military, like the hundreds of US military bases scattered throughout the world in many different countries. And then there are, the militant actions that the US takes to maintain its global empire, like regime change and sponsoring of violence in the global South. But also, I think the US maintains its empire through economic means as well. And here in the US, we tend to have the strict separation of politics. We tend to have two politics. We have our domestic politics and our international politics. But in reality, because the US is an empire and because our actions have consequences throughout the world, these two spheres are really one and the same. And one of the anecdotes I like to share to like illustrate this is, if you're from the West Coast or California, you're probably at least passingly familiar with the California pistachio industry. And yes, I promise this tangent is going somewhere. And the California pistachio industry is famous in the West for extracting huge amounts of water unsustainably from the ecosystem of the Western US. However, what you may not know is that the California pistachio industry is also the #1 lobbyer in favor of keeping US sanctions on Iran. And the reason is that Iran also has a pistachio industry, and they're afraid that if sanctions fall and Iran is allowed to export its pistachios to the US, then that'll drive California pistachio growers out of business. And for that reason, we immiserate literally millions of people in Iran. And I think that idea that countries are being immiserated and resources are being extracted to keep people in the global north wealthy is very much a hallmark of empire. And as for the second part of that question about non-American countries that are imperialist, I would say that imperialism is not a uniquely American problem. And I think like in certain cases, it makes sense to say other countries can be imperialist. But at the same time, you also have to be cognizant of the fact that the vast majority of countries are in the US system and obey the Washington Consensus. Like there are, let's say, about 200 countries in the world. And of those, let's say maybe 190 or 180 are in the IMF, are okay with US bases on their territory and things of that nature. And as an American citizen, I can't control what the governments of Russia or China do, but I can control what my own government does. So I do think that's a very important point to make, that regardless of how we view imperialism by other countries, as Americans, as residents of the global North, we have to take action where we can and maximize our impact in reducing American imperialism.
Does anyone else want to add on to Ishan?
Oh yeah, I also want to add on to that. So something I would also like to add, and someone in the chat commented this, but they pointed out, right, like there is no real comparison with the scope and scale of US dominance and US violence. And this is a very, very correct statement. And I just want to give kudos to the person that typed that in the chat, because this is kind of just a fact, right? Like within the current geopolitical arrangement, the world is mostly dominated by US influence and like US power. And, you know, say what you will about countries that we could also sort of technically consider to be a part of this imperialist arrangement, countries like in the European Union or countries like Japan, but by far the United States remains like the most primary antagonist within the current geopolitical arrangement that we find ourselves. So I think, again, like it is very important for us to focus on the target, not only just because, like, you know, we are American citizens, but because empirically there, again, is no country that has managed to commit like the same scale and scope of violence and domination that the United States have. So it makes perfect sense for us, right, as anti-imperialists to focus on US imperialism, because that is, for the most part, the principal contradiction of our time. And to also sort of talk about like the charges of like imperialism towards US designated enemy states like China and Russia, I would say like in the case of a country like China, the charge of imperialism is a little difficult to justify, because when we look at a country like China, we don't see China to engage in, you know, assassinations of sovereign leaders like the United States and other Western countries have done in the past. We don't see China using financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank to debt trap and or financially ensnare other countries that attempt to pursue models of social development that are contrary to the Washington consensus. So yeah, I just want to say, like, I think whenever we talk about like the imperialisms of other countries, we run the risk of forgetting that empirically, again, there is no country that has committed as much violence as the United States. And then we also sort of like lose track of like our main target, which is US imperialism.
Yeah, you're right that there's a pretty simple empirical answer to the question. I started trying to map US military bases on this map behind me, and there's over 800 US military bases around the world, and no other country matches that scale. The US military budget is bigger than something like the next 10 countries combined. And in the case of China, the US is surrounding China with hundreds of military bases. So yeah, it's really not on the same scale. Anyone else have anything to add? All right, so our next question, I wanted to also ask about, some current events and issues of imperialism and colonialism that we are, seeing in the news that young people might be trying to understand, but through the imperial media, which obviously distorts these issues and makes them really hard to understand the material realities. So I wanted to ask about what is going on in Palestine right now. The Israeli occupation bombed Gaza last night, and in recent days, the occupiers have stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque to prevent Palestinians from worshiping during Ramadan. They've injured and arrested hundreds. And last year, right around the same time, Israel's 11-day siege of Gaza killed hundreds of Palestinians, displaced tens of thousands. So I wanted to see if anyone would jump in and maybe share what young people should understand about what is happening in Palestine through the framework of imperialism and what we're talking about tonight.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna sort of go back to the crude versus rationalized sort of a dichotomy here, just in terms of Israel is sort of unique as an imperial colonial power, is that they struggle on like sort of a principled scale to rationalize in the same way that a lot of other states have, or neocolonialize in the same way, because the Zionist project is sort of at its very heart is crude. It is about sort of demographic domination and land and whatnot, in the same way that a lot of other colonial projects are. But I think the reason why a lot of people view the Israeli occupation as sort of uniquely violent, especially at a point where a lot of other nations have gotten quite smart and sort of insidious in their messaging, where Israel falls short in that sense, that they are very much open about supremacy and domination and whatnot, is I think that's a unique sort of settler colonial situation. I think as well with young people, infographics were mentioned a while ago, but there's a sense of if a messaging is repeated enough to young people, it's sort of like the line that they take. Like you'll see your classmates being like, this is a complex religious conflict. And I think if you first and foremost understand the Zionist project as a colonial project, or more specifically almost a European colonial project that is predicated on supremacy and domination, but also I think land, like specific material extraction, or I don't know quite the word for it, but I think that's why, you know, the Israel or the Zionist project seems sort of uniquely crude. I think they've had, I don't want to say trouble, I think it's sort of opposed to the very nature of Israel as a state to rationalize it, in the same way that a lot of other states have managed to. I think, although I don't agree with this sentiment, a lot of people have called it sort of the last colonial frontier, just because it is so sort of reminiscent of old sort of pre-independence sort of crude colonials. But I think also it has similarly sort of caught up with other states in the sense of pink washing and greenwashing and whatnot. I think I just want to sort of not necessarily warn young people to not fall for Israel's messaging, especially when you see such crude displays of domination and just obscene acts of murder and whatnot, as we saw in the past week.
And something I also wanted to talk about was, again, like when we think about imperialism as this like global system, I think it's also important to consider, right, these like geopolitical alliances that are forming between different countries. And when we look at the sort of situation in Palestine, we see a vassal state that is supported by the United States, that is again responsible for committing unjustified acts of violence against Palestinian people. And so, again, I think it's really important for us to stress the fact that within the imperialist arrangement, there is this like principal contradiction, which is the United States, which supports, again, some of the most reactionary regimes around the world. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to like add that in there and make sure we pay attention to those geopolitical arrangements and those underlying alliances, because when we think about countries that some people might consider to be imperialist in a very crude and I would say reductionist sense, countries like China and Russia that are very principled in their support for the Palestinian people, I think it's really useful to justify that also with how the United States is one of the biggest supporters of the Zionist project.
Just to jump in, I think, I believe it was Joe Biden that said something along the lines of, if Israel didn't exist, we would have to invent it. And until today, I'm shocked that he actually said that, just because of how revealing that is as a quote and how much it lays bare the reality that Israel functions essentially as an imperial proxy for the United States. It exists because it serves American foreign policy goals. And, you know, straight from the mouths of the imperialists themselves, Israel, the core reason why Israel exists is because it accomplishes the function of maintaining that system of extraction in the Middle East. And I think that is incredibly revealing. And, you know, you don't even have to like analyze it too deeply. They themselves are saying it.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to see how the rhetoric has changed over time, because now we see a lot of progressivism disguised as, or Zionism disguised as progressivism, colonialism disguised as progressivism, when 100 years ago, the very founders of Israel and Zionism were quite open that this was a colonial project and that Israel's existence was predicated upon the violent removal of the Palestinian people from their homeland. So I actually wanted to ask a follow-up question from someone in the chat. John asked, what do the panelists see as the role of nonviolent strategies and tactics in anti-imperialist movements? So yeah, does anyone have any thoughts on that question?
Just briefly, I am never one to disregard or discredit nonviolent movements. I think they have potential, but I think a lot of the time nonviolent movements are only evoked as sort of supreme over or somehow more morally pure than violent resistance. And I think as much as I have respect for nonviolent movements, and you can see historically they have had power, I think more sort of some rhetoric power rather than any sort of, well, I mean, it's a case-by-case basis, but I think that's sort of where their worth lies in sort of a rhetoric act, an act of sort of a performance of that sort of nature. But I think also we must not evoke non-violence as more moral or better than violent movements. I don't think people tend to do that, but I think in a lot of ways, when you see a lot of people who are well-meaning say, well, why can't they just go about this in a non-violent way? You know, why? I think it is because violence is taught to us in a very biased way. Violence can be wielded by some, but it is immoral and unnecessary when it's wielded by others. So I have a lot of respect for non-violent movements, and I've seen where they have, had real change. But I think at the same time, I will always support colonized and imperialized people who want to take up arms and return violence. Fanon has a good quote that I'm not going to be able to say sort of verbatim about the absolute violence of colonialism can only be defeated by the absolute sort of violence in return by the colonized people. I think that's important to know.
So yeah, and whenever people bring up this question of nonviolence, right, it's always used to delegitimize the struggles of oppressed people. So I always like to bring up the Paulo Freire quote where he goes on to say, with the establishment of a relationship of oppression, violence has already begun. And I think that's important, right? Because when we have these people who critique the struggles of oppressed people around the world, who often feel like there is no other tactic to resort to but violent means, it's important to again provide that contextualization to show them that violence has already begun, violence is currently happening. And so the question really is, right, like to what extent do you support the violence of oppressed people? And to further add on to that, right, like to what extent you support the violence that's being done onto oppressed people by their oppressor. I find that to be a really useful strategy to, again, sort of highlight that contradiction. And I want to say, like, for the anti-imperialist struggles, like in the global north, I think we need to be tactical about whatever strategies that we do use. And I think for the most part, some of the most proven tactics, at least in the global north, have shown that it's going to be primarily through nonviolent means that we are able to accomplish substantial reforms, I guess I would say.
Yeah, sort of going off what Aaron said, I'm not inherently pro-violence. I'm not inherently anti-violence either. I'm pro whatever works. And I think it's perfectly acceptable to have an approach where which is a case-by-case basis. And I think there are examples in history where nonviolence was the correct choice and the choice that worked. And I think there are cases in history where that was not true. And I think, the history books are full of examples of countries that exist today that would not be independent if there had not been at least some militancy among people who are pro-independence in those countries. And Fatuma, you brought up Fanon, and I think like the Algerian War of Independence is an amazing example of this. Algeria as a country would not exist today without an armed Algerian independence movement. And again, I would sort of question the idea that it's like a necessarily a strict binary. I think in many cases, violent movements can provide impetus to non-violent ones as well, and can provide urgency to them. Like the Indian independence movement, which is something that I draw a lot of examples from, is famously like held up as an example of like this sort of non-violent protest movement that achieved all of its goals and was a great success. But actually, the Indian independence movement had many violent wings as well, and wings where people actually took up arms against the British colonizers and British invaders. And I think that, and at the time, that was generally recognized as a major reason why the British acceded to the demands of the nonviolent movement. And I think that that concept that sometimes violent resistance is necessary to begin the road of making change is something that's important.
Thank you all so much. This is a really important conversation for us to have now and to continue having, especially I think at Massachusetts Peace Action, which is a peace organization. And the reasons people here support peace really vary, and this dialogue will continue happening because it's important to have and hash out why we disagree on some of these things. For this next question, it's backtracking a little bit, but before, mostly Aaron, you were talking about various geopolitical alliances that exist around the world and the roles that these play in imperialism, and how the intricacies of them are like definitely not well understood by a lot of people. And I'm wondering, this is a question for everyone, but how these global alliances and how imperialism in general has a role in a lot of the major conflicts and challenges that are facing the world today. So the COVID pandemic, trade war, climate change, other armed conflicts and wars. Yeah, go ahead.
No, yeah, so I think, again, once we understand, right, that US imperialism has sort of been constantly changing and evolving throughout the ages, through, again, like studying the history of these changes and these developments, that we can really make sense of how these contemporary geopolitical alliances came to be, and potentially even predict some of like the future trajectories of these alliances. And so typically whenever I have to sort of introduce this concept to people, I again always sort of root my analysis again in the Cold War, because the Cold War is primarily the moment in which we see the creation of these like very interesting geopolitical alliances that in a lot of different ways are fundamentally the same. During the Cold War, when the United States was attempting to combat like the threat of communism, when it was attempting to prevent progressive governments throughout the third world from exercising any degree of autonomy, this often led to the creation of alliances with very reactionary and sometimes even fascist political formations, whether this be in the coup against Allende's Chile, which resulted in the installment of a fascist military dictatorship, whether this be in the bombings of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Throughout the history of United States foreign policy, we see that the United States, in an effort to prevent any sort of degree of progress from advancing, the United States has been forced into making alliances with incredibly reactionary formations as a means of securing global hegemony. And I think that context is really important for understanding the alliances that exist today, because, you know, if the United States, right, is this global defender of democracy, is this harbinger of like peace and justice for all, why is the United States supporting a regime like Saudi Arabia that is bombing millions of innocent civilians in Yemen? Why does the United States give so much military aid to a imperialist project like Israel, which enacts untold violences against Palestinian people, right? Like, we have to understand first and foremost that the underlying logic behind US foreign policy is maintaining and securing global hegemony, which again results in the United States having no other choice but to align itself with some of the most reactionary regimes that the world has ever seen. So that is sort of how I would answer the first part of the question. And what was the second part of the question again?
The second part, you kind of answered it, but the second part was, it kind of just listed specific world conflicts that exactly what you just talked about might, like imperialism might play a role in these. So the pandemic, climate change, other issues. If you want to talk about something more specifically, go for it. But you honestly answered the question.
Okay, I'll let someone else speak. So I don't want to take up too much time for people.
Thanks for answering. Thank you.
I think one of the hallmarks of imperialism is how it weaponizes events in service of its own goals and in service of capitalism. And especially with the pandemic has sort of made this more obvious in many ways. One thing I remember from when the pandemic was at its worst was that Cuba has had and continues to have two COVID vaccines that are highly effective and that work. However, because of the American embargo, they were not able to import the syringes to actually give the vaccine to people. And I think that's shocking that that example of imperialism doesn't just serve the goals of capitalism, but also simply immiserates people just to immiserate people and hurts people just to hurt people. And I definitely think that one of the natures of modern day imperialism is that every event that happens is twisted and turned in a way to support the goals of capitalism.
All right, so I'm going to ask one more question targeted to Aaron, and I can't believe we're already almost out of time, but then we're going to have to move to a closing question. So before the end of the night, we wanted to make sure we ask about climate, since this is a really important issue for young people, especially in the US, but often we don't discuss how imperialism is one of the root causes of the climate crisis that we see today. So also, the Green New Deal has been one of the biggest policy priorities that is, mobilizing young people in recent years. And there have been other groups like the Red Nation, for example, which is an Indigenous-led group that released proposals for a Red Deal. And they argued that the Green New Deal doesn't do enough to address colonialism and imperialism's contributions to the climate crisis, and incorporated, Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous liberation into a climate deal. So I wanted to ask Aaron, how can we address the climate crisis through an anti-imperialist internationalist lens? And could you elaborate on these critiques of the Green New Deal? Does the Green New Deal do enough?
No, yeah, so that's a really big question. So to keep it simple and sort of tackle it one by one, I would say the Green New Deal, specifically the social democratic Green New Deal that we see people like AOC and Ed Markey champion, is a very inadequate solution to the climate crisis, because the social democratic Green New Deal, right, is not a Green New Deal that's concerned with the question of imperialism, concerned with the questions of colonialism, which are very, very important for having a adequate or just like climate transition. And so I think one of the ways in which these social democratic Green New Deals sort of fail to provide like an adequate just transition for so many people and so many communities is primarily through the fact that these are Green New Deals that do not really seek to challenge the structure of capitalism fundamentally. These are very much so reformist Green New Deals that, by and large, are not really concerned with tackling the inequality that exists between countries in the global North and countries in the global South. And it's, again, really important for us to consider this like anti-imperialist lens in our Green New Deal, because capitalism and imperialism are global systems. And similarly, the climate crisis is a global crisis. And said crisis is going to impact all of us in uneven ways. For countries in the global South, countries that have been imperialized and who've had resources extracted from them for decades now, they are going to be some of the people hit first and foremost, like hardest by the climate crisis. And so it is very, very important for us to consider the unprecedented levels of inequality that exists between the global north and the global south if we are genuine in our desire to create an adequate Green New Deal for these people. And I typically don't really suggest the social democratic Green New Deal that people like AOC and Ed Markey champion. I typically suggest people check out the Kambachamba People's Agreement that was essentially a climate agreement that was endorsed by around 200 or so indigenous activists in Bolivia who have done a very, very good job in outlining what a anti-imperialist and internationalist Green New Deal looks like. And I promise you, they have done a much better job in elaborating on what that would look like than I ever could. But for the most part, right, they are, again, just highlighting a Green New Deal that is concerned with addressing these like fundamentally exploitative relations that exist between the global north and the global south, which is, again, something that we have to consider if we are sincere in having an adequate Green New Deal.
Thank you, Aaron, so much. And thanks, Yao, for pointing out this problem of kind of almost placing all of our hope in a Green New Deal that isn't actually even sufficient. I'm going to wrap it up with a final question for everyone to try to tie everything together and take home this message about the importance of youth being involved in this anti-imperialism work, like the three of you are. So the question is just, do you have advice for making anti-imperialism work more accessible to young people and how young people can actually get involved? And then secondary, how would you suggest that young people with limited time start to actually accurately learn about past and present imperialism beyond what we're taught in school? So anyone can go ahead first.
I think this is sort of pulls it back to what we were talking about at the front, but young people are not unmotivated in regards to action and sort of learning and sort of change and organization. I just think the thing that sort of seems to be missing is the presence, or the more noticeable presence, of anti-imperialist voices. I mean, for a lot of young people, the most left that they can sort of fathom, that they've seen as sort of acceptable, is sort of like the same sort of people Aaron was talking about recently, sort of the AOC, Bernie types. I think Corbyn is a bit more left, that sort of an old like version of that we have in the UK. But I think for a lot of young people, when presented with anti-imperialist perspectives, are more than willing to sort of learn and sort of change their analyses. I feel like a lot of people think that is missing. But in regards to people who do want to learn, I think one, getting involved in an organization or organizing amongst yourselves if you live in sort of a place that doesn't have any organizations for you. But I also think we live in the age of the internet, and I know this is sort of an overdone thing, but information for the most part has been more available now than it has been in the past. And I think if you know how to really harness that tool, it can provide you with a lot of great perspectives that you might not have otherwise come across. And I think it can be a good springboard for a learning and a journey, because I think everyone is constantly learning and should be constantly learning.
Yeah, I definitely think that, especially if you're a young American, I think that there are a lot of anti-imperialist organizations, both those who are existing and those that are just sort of popping up. And it's an amazing time to get involved in anti-imperialist organizing. And, just to name a few, here at DSA, we're sort of revitalizing our anti-imperialist work and, working on expanding the work we do internationally. And there are also many organizations in the US, like the National Network on Cuba, et cetera. And I think it doesn't matter what organization you join or what work you do, but as long as you're doing something, I think that's very important. It's a great time to get involved.
No, yeah. So what I guess I would say is, these are world systems that we're dealing with. It's not just a isolated capitalist system. It's not just an isolated imperialist system. It's not just an isolated climate crisis. All of these things are very much so interconnected. And while that may seem overwhelming to us as individuals, it's important to remember that individuals aren't really the people who make change at the end of the day. Change is really something that only comes about through like mass or popular struggle. And so it is very, very important for each and every one of us, right, who is genuine and fighting against these systems to join a anti-imperialist organization, anti-capitalist organization that's in your area. I'm a member of the CPUSA. I'm also a member of the CPUSA's youth wing, which is the Young Communist League. So that's always going to be an organization that I plug in. But yeah, again, it's just getting involved in an organization and doing that ground level work to really unite as many progressive forces, as many anti-imperialist forces as possible.
I think that's a great way to leave off, and our timing is perfect. Thank you so much again, everyone, for coming tonight. We will email you very soon with the link to the recording, resources to get involved. Our speakers' social media links are in the chat, so please give them a follow, support all their work, and we hope what you heard tonight resonated with you and that everyone will, get more involved in the future. Thanks again.